So here I'm going to talk about some arguments in favor of vegetarianism, which is very much a classic topic in applied ethics. There's just tons and tons and tons of literature on this one. So I'm going to look at a couple of the more famous ones. And so mainly I'll be focusing on Tom Reagan's argument in favor of animal rights, but in there I'll also definitely be talking about the utilitarian argument in favor of vegetarianism, which is often attributed to people like Peter Singer. Because Tom Reagan kind of starts by talking about utilitarianism in order to contrast his argument for animal rights with that argument in favor of vegetarianism that comes from utilitarianism. So feel free to pause here if you want to see kind of some different positions on vegetarianism that people could take. But I'm going to go ahead and move on to the Peter Singer style argument for animal welfare. So let's see. The utilitarian argument's fairly straightforward, as it frequently is. This first premise I threw in there just to make it clear that we're talking about utilitarianism. And so the real kind of heart of the argument starts in premise 2 here, that the many animals, especially the animals that we're talking about eating, farm animals, of all the mammals, maybe even some of the birds, maybe even some of the other things, possibly fishes and so on, that could also feel happiness and suffering. That is, they are sentient according to what utilitarians mean by sentient. It just means the ability to feel happiness and suffering. So it seems pretty clear that a lot of the animals that we raise and slaughter for food can actually feel happiness and suffering. That is, they are sentient. And when they're raised and slaughtered for food, it causes them to suffer, reduces their happiness, and that suffering and reduction in happiness on the part of the animals far outweighs any happiness that the human meat eaters feel by eating those animals. So in terms of the balance of happiness and suffering, it seems from this approach that utilitarianism is telling us we should not be doing this, right? That we should stop raising and slaughtering these animals for food right away. Or perhaps transition out of the industry somehow, but we should stop doing this. And if you've seen any pictures or videos or anything like that of factory farming, it's pretty obvious that the animals are suffering under those conditions. I just have one shot here of just the feedlots where this is not natural for the animals. They're not eating grass. They're all living kind of smashed together. And so there's a lot of disease and stuff. And this is really a very mild example of the kinds of conditions that a lot of these animals are facing. Okay, so Singer goes on to explain, and Tom Reagan agrees with this point from Singer, that, so suppose somebody sees this utilitarian argument and they're like, well, okay, I can see that, like, if I were in those circumstances that the animals are in, that I would definitely feel suffering and that would be bad. But these animals, they're not human. So why should I care? Well, this is, as it's called, a speciesist attitude. That is, the suffering, also the happiness, but in this case in particular, the suffering of these animals is just kind of ignored or discounted merely because they're members of a different species. So the speciesism is very similar to the other kinds of bad isms that we're familiar with, whether it's racism or sexism or ageism or any of those other kinds of bad isms, where what's going on is that the interests or the feelings somehow of the members of one group are discounted or ignored merely because they're not members of your own group, right? Merely because they're members of a particular group. So mere group membership all by itself is not enough of a reason for us to discount the feelings or the interests of the members of that group. We need a morally relevant reason for discounting their interests. So, for example, we might say that plants, eating plants, well, that kills the plants, and killing, we would think, in as far as killing humans, that's wrong, unless we have like a really, really important overriding justification for committing that killing. But otherwise, it's wrong. But nevertheless, killing plants isn't wrong in anything like the same way because we have a morally relevant reason. The plants don't have any kind of mentality. They don't have sort of a consciousness, a conscious view on the world. And most ethicists believe that it's that consciousness that is the basis for anything like a right to life or a right to not be killed somehow. So uh, we do have a morally relevant reason for discounting the interests, so to speak, of plants. And when I say interests of plants, it's really sort of metaphorical in the sense because, like I said, they don't have a consciousness and full interests and plans and desires and so on require some kind of consciousness. So they only have interests in this other sense that, yeah, they're sort of set up to try to stay alive, but they're mindless, right? And so it's okay to kill plants. At least it's far more okay to kill plants than it is to kill humans. So it's not speciesist to discount those so-called interests of plants. All right. So that will become relevant later on. And so one of the approaches here that Tom Regan takes to utilitarianism is he's very much in favor of this conclusion. He wants to promote vegetarianism, but he just doesn't like the utilitarian approach. And the main problem with the utilitarian approach, in addition to the fact that he just doesn't like utilitarianism as a theory of ethics, but in particular here, there are too many loopholes. That is, there are ways to continue raising and slaughtering animals for food without running afoul of the utilitarian argument. One of the most dramatic ones is this one over here, the very humane farming techniques. There's a serious question as to how common these kinds of farming techniques are, but at least there's this possibility that the animals are treated very well, they're taken care of during their life, and so they're not suffering. And then potentially during the slaughtering process, if it's done just right, they don't suffer at all, they're just killed instantly. So there's no suffering involved. And in fact, the animals are happy while they're alive. So there's a lot of happiness that's being produced here. And so it's not clear what would be wrong about this from the utilitarian approach. There's a variety of other cases, more hypothetical ones, say like humans who somehow or another just get overwhelmingly, ecstatically happy from eating meat. And so their happiness outweighs the suffering that the animals that they're eating might have felt. That's maybe we have reasons for questioning the plausibility of that kind of scenario, but the very humane farming exception is a big one, and that's enough for Regan to say, oh yeah, I don't like that utilitarian approach, and he wants to switch to the rights approach. So let's take a look at that. So he starts off his argument here by making it clear that something that I think we all agree with, that we do not tolerate the raising and slaughtering of humans for food, even if they are kept in very good conditions, they're really happy during their life. We would never say, oh, well, it's okay to go ahead and kill them instantly, right? So that they don't feel any suffering during the slaughtering. It's okay to go ahead and slaughter and eat humans as long as they were happy during their lifetime. We do not say that, right? We still think it's seriously wrong to do that to humans, even if we're not causing them to suffer at all. Why? Well, the answer should be obvious. It's because at least they have a right to life. So that should be enough for us to say, absolutely not, we will not allow the raising and slaughtering of any humans for food. Okay, so I've kind of hinted at this already, but Tom Regan here takes an approach similar to other philosophers where he describes sort of the basis for having a right to life. It's not being a member of a certain species. It's something about your mentality, something about your consciousness that gives you the right to life. The way that Regan approaches is he calls it being the subject of a life. And by subject of a life, he means that an individual that has a subjective view on the world. They sort of recognize that they've got this point of view. They recognize at least a basic distinction between the outside world and themselves. They have interests and plans and desires for themselves and what they're going to do. Maybe not like way off into the future necessarily, but at least sort of in the moment, they kind of want to do something. They have goals that they work towards and a conscious sort of awareness of themselves and those goals and those interests and their own emotions and feelings. So this is something that certainly humans have, even, and this is an important point, even very severely mentally disabled humans have, they are still the subject of a life. And so they still have a right to life. Interestingly, maybe permanent coma patients do not. So another way of describing this would be, brain dead people or people in a vegetative state. That's sort of telling that we give it that label. So no consciousness left at all, no possibility of kind of waking up from that because their brain has deteriorated too much. So there's no consciousness. So the right to life is just gone. So the moral status of permanent coma patients, brain dead people, their moral status has changed quite dramatically. And so it's very common in the ethics literature for such people to be described as no longer having a right to life in anything like the way you and I have it, sort of awake humans have it. Okay, so as long as you're the subject of a life, then you have a right to life. And we recognize that even severely mentally disabled humans they are the subject of a life and therefore have a right to life. So now maybe you can anticipate where Regan's argument is going to go here. So many non-human animals are also the subject of a life. A lot of these mammals, maybe all mammals, or at least most mammals, and certainly what we think of as farm animals, do have the mental capacity, the mental state to be the subject of their own lives. On par with severely mentally disabled humans. Now, we don't want to say that it's the exact same kind of consciousness. What is cow consciousness or pig consciousness? What is it really like to be a goat, for example? I don't know. But it seems pretty clear that they have a level of consciousness that's on par with severely mentally disabled humans. So it does seem like these animals qualify as being the subject of their own lives. So many non-human animals are the subject of a life. Anything that's the subject of a life has a right to life. Therefore, many non-human animals have a right to life. So that's his argument, right? It seems fairly simple once we get to this point. So here's another way of kind of describing what he's getting about here. So if we believe that severely mentally disabled humans have a right to life, then we must, as a matter of just sort of basic logical consistency, we must accept that many non-human animals also have a right to life because they have similar sort of mental levels, consciousness levels. Or again, another way of saying it is that if it's permissible to kill and eat one group, the animals, then it's permissible to kill and eat both groups, the animals and the severely mentally disabled humans. And we're not, by and large, I hope, willing to say that it's permissible to kill and eat severely mentally disabled humans, so therefore it should be impermissible to kill and eat any of these. And to think otherwise is speciesist, right? To say, oh, well, yeah, they maybe have similar sort of consciousness levels, similar mentality or something, but it's not human consciousness, right? They're different. They're just a different species, so they don't count. Well, as we said, that's speciesist. You need a morally relevant difference between the members of the two groups, humans and these other animals. You need a morally relevant difference there, besides just saying different species. That's not good enough. We need more. And so unless we have that other morally relevant reason, we have to accept that these other animals have a right to life the same as we do. So that's Regan's argument. It's generally considered to be a fairly strong kind of argument. It's interesting to think about how this applies to other ways in which we interact with animals. We've been talking about farming and consuming the animals, but we have got lots of other ways that we sort of interact with animals as a society. And so how would Regan's argument apply here? Well, the standard procedure is to think in all of these cases that I've got in front of us here, to think, would it be okay to use severely mentally disabled humans in the same way that we're using the animals in these cases? So to put them into zoos and circuses to test them, against their will or without them even being aware of it, to race them, to keep them as pets, all these different things. If it's not okay to do that to the severely mentally disabled humans, then it's not going to be okay to do it to the animals either, according to Regan's argument here. Okay, I'll go ahead and stop there. Thanks.